So, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to say thank you for joining us today for this panel discussion or roundtable discussion. My first announcement is that we are really sorry, we do apologize that Mr. Takale couldn't come because he got sick. But I'm really pleased to welcome Mr. Paul Moritz here, who is an MCC visiting fellow at here at the MCC, and he's also a PhD student at the University of Leiden, if I'm correct. And also thank you for Viktor Marsai, the the director of Migration Research Institute and the associate professor of University of Public Service. Thank you for joining us today. One more technical question or remark for this today is that I would like to ask you to just collect your questions, and at the end of the roundtable discussion you will have the opportunity to ask the questions if you have one. Please just raise your hands and I will just ask you. First of all, we would like to start our today event by Mr. Paul Moritz's presentation on the general African trends regarding migration. So I would like to give the floor to you, Mr. Moritz.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be very brief because this is obviously mainly a roundtable. If could you put the slideshow just on for me? I'm going to just not go through any of that. I'm just going to run through the 15 trends more or less, which I think will be relevant for the conversation. The reason why I do this is obviously because I think that obviously I grew up in South Africa and I knew nothing about Central Europe, and so therefore I simply do this in order to maybe create some context and not assume that everyone is like super well read on Africa, because simply like I said, I didn't know much about Central Europe before I got here. So just some brief trends in 2023 that we have picked up, and this is mainly based on the African Migration Report brought out by the African Union, and then the Center of Security Studies has got some stuff as well. So there's a big funding squeeze, as the IMF calls it. Now obviously the IMF has got their own agenda and wherever they're going, but in terms of financial analysis, they do offer interesting analyses. So 35% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa was estimated to live under that mark of $2.15 as of 2019, and we know that COVID has made this a lot worse. 2022, we know that 132 million people were acutely food insecure. This is obviously being increased by weather patterns, by lack of funding, by various other projects or various other factors, which we can probably go into in the roundtable discussion. And then of the 45 countries that are officially seen as sub-Saharan Africa, 20 of those are facing double-digit inflation. In countries like Ghana, this is very bad at the moment. The South African rand, for instance, was just between 15 and 16 rand to $1 when I came to Europe February last year, and now it's about 20 rand. So that is a massive fall of about 20% in your buying capacity. And then the growth in sub-Saharan Africa, the economic growth will decline to 3.6% in 2023. Now this sounds massive in a European context, but you've got to remember these are small economies, and the big economies are very stagnant. So South Africa is looking at a 0.1% growth. So the countries that have like 5 or 6% growth, you have to know that those are countries that are very badly developed, and so that's not necessarily. So saying 3.6% needs to be seen in context. We're not talking about European or Asian numbers. A second problem that we're having when it comes to Africa research is this problem of data challenges. The first point there is very important, and that is that many of the countries, 14 of the 45 countries, last updated their migrant statistics in the year 2000. And this is obviously a problem because most of the countries that did not bring new data in are the countries that we want to research. And then you see an increase from 2000 to 2019 from 15 million to about 26.6 million, but we know that a more realistic estimate is in the range of 40 million, of which anything over 21 million is within Africa itself when it comes to migratory patterns. And then let me just move on to some final points that I'd like to make. The problem in Africa is that there will be a massive increase as well in climate migrants. This we know, obviously, if we look at the Bantu migrations that started about 4,000 years ago, we know that those in what is today the Cameroon, Nigeria area started in the first place because the Lake Chad basin was drying up, which you're more of a specialist in than I am, and people had to move away. And therefore we see certain of those problems. And so the typical issue is that smuggling and trafficking are likely to increase. This is already a problem that we're seeing, and sort of illicit migratory patterns as well. And then the African migratory policy framework is, to my mind, a very optimistic document which does not necessarily deal with the realistic policies on the ground. And then we can speak about that. And a final point that I would like to make is, if you are interested in African migration, it will be very valuable to watch out for African elections, because elections tend to not necessarily bring stability. And specifically, I mentioned a couple there, but I think the Zimbabwe election is going to be very interesting, because it could be the first time that the ZANU-PF lose an outright election. We do think that somewhere in the 2000s Mugabe lost an election to Morgan Tsvangirai, but we know how that ended up. So this could be a very interesting one, and how the ZANU-PF reacts to that could be interesting as well. Burkina Faso and Mali also have elections, and those two countries are, for obvious reasons, very pertinent at the moment. So I'm just going to stop there in terms of just briefly introducing the statistics for sub-Saharan African migration, and then we can go over to questions, and hopefully I have some creative answers, and hopefully some of those answers are true.
So we can have this kind of sensation that more and more Africans are leaving the African continent, but what does the figures show? Can you elaborate on this question, Paul, and then Victor?
So I think the first and foremost answer is yes, a lot of people are leaving from Africa. We tend to see in European media the rubber inflatable boats coming over from Tunisia to Italy, or landing in an island in the Mediterranean. And while that is definitely a part of it, and a lot of people are dying in that way, and a lot of that is illicit, most migration and displacement that we see in Africa is within the continent itself, and quite often within the country itself. So there's obviously this idea that you get three kinds of borders between countries. You get natural borders. For instance, the Rio Grande between Mexico and the USA is a natural border. Then you get something like a delimited border, where over generations we've had wars and we've decided this is the border. Something like the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland is a good example. There were treaties, not everyone necessarily agrees, but there's a border. The third one is what we call an arbitrary border, and this is when a power from the outside draws a border. And this is not necessarily something new to the Hungarian context, although I'm not going to elaborate on the Hungarian context because you all know more than I do. But in Africa, this is a big thing. So you'll see people moving within one country from one zone to another zone, and this is a massive issue. So briefly taking all of that together, we do see a lot of people fleeing from Africa, if I can say that, but within Africa itself, the migration and displacement is actually a lot worse. Within a country like Kenya, you're seeing people literally growing up in camps, and so that's something that I think we should add to the discussion when thinking about it.
Yeah, and I think it's very important to underline that most migration within and beyond Africa is a regular migration. So they are not, it's not forced displacement. It's very important to underline, even if we have a check at the statistics, the forced displacement numbers, including both refugees and internally displaced persons, are extremely high, and the numbers are increasing. I think it's another important topic is that in general, when we are speaking about African migration, and in general, if we use the term migration, we consider it international migration. Why the biggest pattern of migration within Africa and all around the globe is rural-urban migration. So if you consider 1.4 billion people in Africa altogether, it's also another big question what we mean under Africa, whether the whole continent or just the sub-Saharan part. But hundreds of millions of people participating in rural-urban migration in the continent. And my last remark is that the general migration patterns of Africa are not different significantly from other parts of the world. Even if we check the mobility numbers, for example, in Asia, there are much higher percentage people who are moving across international borders. But similarly to other parts of the world, the percentage of people who are participating in this mobility is increasing. So 40 years ago, the people who participated in Africa in international mobility was 2.2%. Now it's about 3.5%, which means if we consider a continent more than 2.4 billion people, and by the mid of this century, according to UN estimation, 2.5 billion people, it means all tens of millions of additional people. Even it's interesting that in Paul used the data from 2019 when the number of international migrant stock in Africa was within and beyond 28 million or something. The latest IOM estimation is already more than 33 million people. So the number is increasing because of the whole weight of Africa in the demographic pressure.
So, as I can understand, you mentioned basically that economic reasons are behind this kind of migratory trends, but there are other parts of it, for example, political violence or, for example, jihadist movements. So what kind of other push factors do you see? And after that, in regard of Europe, what are the pull factors?
Yes, I think the obvious pull factor is financial and economical. So we see that a country like Nigeria has got more funding entering its borders from remittances. And then I have to say that, this comes to the point that was just made, not all of these remittances comes from America or from Europe. A lot of it comes from countries like Cameroon, or also because the Nigerians are obviously spread out all through Africa. We've got a large Nigerian community in South Africa as well. But remittances play a very important part in their economy. The Zimbabwean population in South Africa, which according to some estimates could be up to 3 million, which is about 5% of the total population. It's very frequent for them to send money home. That is, in most cases, sort of the chief focus of why they moved in the first place. So I think that the primary pull factor is that, but the push and the pull factors often work together, as we've seen globally. But so you have various things coming together, and at the one point you have to remember that the agricultural revolutions that we would have seen in other places oftentimes happened long before you had technological innovation, when now you have certain people, and South Africa is a good example for this. And basically the countries within my study context would be South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Botswana, Namibia. All of them have this context where the people have not necessarily been educated to a point where they can hold a job in a city, typically a service level job or even a manufacturing job. So they are dependent on the mining or the agricultural sector, and yet at the same moment you're getting technology in from America that can do the job of 16 or 17 farm workers, and it's one smart piece of machinery. The latest things that they're using in the Free State, which is the central province in South Africa where we produce maize, is a machine that literally zaps with a laser external plants and sort of kills things while it's planting. And so it's very complex. But the point is now you're sitting with large populations, rural populations that really just have no source of income. And then the obvious move for them is this urban migration. So not necessarily because the life that they will live is so much better. It's not like they're going to walk into a 2 or a 3 bedroom apartment with a car or whatever, but oftentimes just because there's no other choice. So I suppose the two work together. In the case of a lot of people from Africa that come to Europe to work, once again it's the same thing. With the currencies in Africa constantly declining, if you have the ability to earn euros or dollars or forints or whatever that's more stable, at the end of the day, after 5 or 10 years, you can go back and buy a big house and for the rest of your life live on a high standard of living. And I think that the discrepancy has become so big for a lot of people that you'll basically do anything in order to get away and get into that market.
Yeah, I think it's very important what Paul emphasized at the beginning, that the general... still in many parts of the world, the general impression about Africa is that there is still civil war, starvation, etc., etc. But we have to underline that the general situation in the continent even after COVID-19, even after the big drought in East and West Africa, and even after the food crisis caused mainly by the Ukrainian war, still after these issues, the general condition in the continent is much better than, for example, in the 90s, when really dozens of civil war, genocide, and real famine occurred in the continent. And yet a much smaller number of people arrived and reached Europe because of different reasons. And I think a key word in this context is possibility. The possibility of access to information, because the telecommunication revolution reached almost the most remote villages of the continent. So African people hold the world in their hands, and they, as Paul mentioned, they see how life is going in Germany or in Hungary or in Japan and different parts of the world, and they raise the question that if it's possible for these people to live among such kind of conditions, why it's not possible in Africa? And if we can't implement or settle it in the continent, perhaps we have to move there. And we have to keep in our mind, ladies and gentlemen, that migration is perhaps the most ancient adaptation strategy in the history of humankind. And not only the access to information, but the access to travel is also is very important. Whether we are speaking about smuggling networks or international commercial flights. So reaching any of African capital is within a day. It's a possibility, and not from Europe to Africa, but also from Africa to Europe. Mainly if you get a nice visa regime, which is available in some connecting nations. So it's an important feature why these migration patterns shifted a lot. Actually, not the last decades, but even just the last couple of years, and the trends are very obvious that the numbers will increase, even if it's very important to underline, as I mentioned, that most of the people that participate in it are participating in regular migration, coming with tourist visa, working visa, student visa, etc., etc. But of course, a lot of people try to utilize the system to find the small gates and the irregular way to reach Europe, and of course, other parts of the world. Because if you have a look at the statistics, people who are leaving Africa, about 60% who is coming to Europe, about 26-7 is going to Asia, which means mainly the Middle East, and the remaining goes to, I don't know, Ocean, North America, etc., etc.
If I can just add to that, we had a very interesting study done in South Africa. It was concluded in 2019, I think. What happened was, obviously the west of South Africa is near the Kalahari Desert, so it's very dry. And there were two towns that the government and one of the local universities had a project to give free internet in the main street. Now, it's a small town, so the main street can easily cover most of the people's living areas. But there was a 12-month discrepancy, and so it was a very good opportunity for the psychology students to go and do studies there. And the two towns are about 60 kilometers away from each other, so they will typically, the children, cousins or so on, would converse maybe once a month or so. And the one town that got free Wi-Fi the year before, they asked the children after 12 months, what do you want to become one day when you are grown up? And they said things like an astronaut, or I want to play for the Chicago Bulls, I want to play basketball, or I want to work in Hollywood, I want to be a barista in San Francisco, the typical, Stephen's not liking my answers, isn't it? But so they wanted the typical American dream, or they wanted to go and see Big Ben after 12 months. And the other town, they asked the children what do they want to do, and they said, I want to be a farm worker, I want to be a waitress, I want to work at the fuel station. And so this trend of technology and smartphones entering into Africa, well, it had the same effect everywhere. All of a sudden, you can literally watch an Instagram video of someone doing that, and you can say, well, why can't I do it? And the moment that someone from your country goes, then all of a sudden you start thinking, well, I had the same education, I've got the same language skills, and therefore there should be some other possibility for me. And obviously, by far the most migration is completely legal, and now there are opportunities because wealthy countries have a lot of job opportunities, especially in terms of things like basic service delivery, caring for elderly people, cleaning, working on railroads, and so forth. So that's a very interesting thing that we're seeing. With this increased awareness comes increased aspiration levels as well.
And where do you see exactly these migratory routes are running? In the southern parts and both on the northern parts? Where are these key migratory routes?
Do you mean where they're going?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, the routes, okay. So historically we saw that they were sort of influenced by colonialism and by where the job opportunities were. So I'll give you a good example. In South Africa, they discovered gold in the 1870s and 1880s, and so you had a lot of Zulu people coming from the southeastern coast doing a 600-kilometer journey to work in the gold mines. And so you had a city of Johannesburg, which is, there's no river there. All of a sudden it has 10 million people. So you only justify that based on that. You'll see the same thing in Mogadishu, you'll see the same thing in Lagos to a certain extent, not necessarily with mining every time, but where there are job opportunities. And so the key routes at the moment still through Africa is two places where there is economic development. So we do see still a lot of movement, say from Malawi and Zimbabwe into South Africa. We do see movement in the north. There is quite a bit of movement into various countries. I think Ghana's obviously historically done well. Zambia tends to attract people, especially with their new leadership for the last 2 or 3 years. And then where the people are leaving is obviously where there are push factors. As I said in the first answer, that'll depend. But you'll see, for instance, a lot of migration at the moment from out of Mali, out of Burkina Faso, due to, like you actually know better than I do, but due to terrorist and fundamentalist activity. So yeah, those are, I think, the primary things to look for at the moment. Oh, and one last thing, and also the cobalt mines in the south of the DRC and the north of Zambia, copper and cobalt mines, they've led to increased job opportunities, but those aren't necessarily cross-border as far as I could tell. A lot of that is within the country itself, and obviously you have M23, some believed to be influenced in some other way by Rwanda, that is also having an effect in the Lake Kivu basin, or Lake Kivu region at the moment.
Yeah, and West Africa is also an important destination because of the big economies, partially, like Nigeria, and the political stability. So it's an interesting feature that from West Africa, a lot of people moving towards Europe. If you check Frontex numbers and figures, a lot of people coming from Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal or Mali. Why a lot of people moving to Cote d'Ivoire, for example, from Mali and Burkina, because of seasonal migration in the farmlands. Yes.
So we have talked about the regular migration. And what do you see about the irregular or illegal migration part of the story? There is this notion that a lot of Africans they just can't really afford to pay for smugglers for these very expensive routes, crossing the Sahara, then crossing, for example, the Mediterranean Sea is not just risky, but it's very expensive as well. So how can these families or African communities collect this money to just pay for the smugglers? Yeah,
I think it's also important to change a little bit the narration about this irregular migration, a little bit within and of course beyond Africa, because the general narration is that vulnerable people, refugees, poor people leaving the continent towards the Gulf and Europe. Actually, most of the people are not the most vulnerable part of the African population because, as Claudia mentioned, the journey costs thousands of dollars or even more money. So actually what we see is the middle class people who are collecting the money and take the perilous journey towards Europe. And actually, I think one of the problems with this is that we are concentrating our efforts, energy, human and financial resources to tackle this phenomenon, not wasting but costing a lot of money for Europe, why actually the most vulnerable people are neglected and sidelined because of these events. So I think it's very important to try to shift these patterns, because for a certain amount of money we can help, let's say, 10 times more people in sub-Saharan Africa than in the gates of Europe. So yes, it's and of course there are different models by the smugglers, how they try to encourage people to go towards Europe, because I mentioned the money, but of course there are certain models, mainly in East Africa, when the people or the persons don't have to pay money at the beginning when they left their Somaliland or Somalia, but they are employed, let's say, in big cities, Addis Ababa, later Khartoum, and if they're lucky, they are really employed in such kind of jobs, dishwasher or other jobs, or farmland, etc., etc. They collect the money, pay, and go further. But in not so nice scenarios, they are tortured, and the families are blackmailed. That okay, your sons, your cousin, your husband is here, so if you don't raise the money, $5,000, we'll kill him and selling his kidney in the black market. So it's a very, very, very perilous journey if people start this.
Yeah, it really is. The more you read about it, the more shocking it is. If I can say something about the move to the south, particularly into South Africa and maybe into Botswana, certain areas and so on, what we'll typically see there is on the South African side, the rule of law is really not enforced. And this is due to a couple of things. So the ANC that have been governing South Africa for about 30 years now, they essentially had, all the way through, they had a Pan-Africanist vision. So they wanted an Africa without borders at some point. So you have this very interesting dynamic where you have, in South Africa, you have xenophobic attacks quite frequently, and they're quite bad. Mostly they are directed at Somalis or Nigerians or some of the big groups in South Africa, and people have been killed. So these attacks happen quite frequently. And then you see certain South African politicians reacting and saying, yes, well, we'll close the borders, we'll build a wall, that sort of narrative. But then when it comes to actually doing that, they refuse to actually engage on it. So the border between South Africa and Zimbabwe is basically porous. And it's a joke. It's been like that as long as I can remember, and no one seems to really be doing anything about it. Now, adding to that, my experience personally, and I have a lot of family who work on farms and who are farmers or gamekeepers or they raise cattle or whatever, our experience has been that illegal immigrants into South Africa are the most humble, the most grateful, the most hardworking people. So it's like, yes, you're harboring someone who is working illegally, and yet they offer such great service. And to a certain extent, you've got this thing of, well, what should I do now? Should I just put them out on the street? Obviously, there's the question, you shouldn't have employed them in the first place. But it is quite a frequent thing to find. We always have this running joke in South Africa, if your waiter is friendly, you can ask them which part of Bulawayo do they come from, which is a city in Zimbabwe. Because we just know if someone is friendly and you get good service, then most probably it's not a local person, which I suppose says there's a lot of tragedy behind that. But so you've got a very difficult point where these people, all of a sudden, especially with the acts of Robert Mugabe, fled literally in millions. And what do you do now? Because a big refugee camp in the north of South Africa isn't necessarily the answer. It would in any case have been impossible. The border is a very long border. And so that's a very difficult conversation. I don't know of any South Africans that will go to the police and say, I have an illegal Zimbabwean or whatever. It's just sort of you understand you've got to help, you've got to do what you can. So it's a very sort of a complex situation. That's where theory and sort of personal experience comes together. Obviously, we have a lot of sort of the illegal drug trade and stuff happening in Johannesburg is run through Nigerian cartels and so on. So we know that, and a lot of them are illegal. But But broadly speaking, I would say in more than 90% of the cases, the people that come really just have no other choice, or they would have died if they didn't leave. So it's a very complex situation. I'm not justifying it, but I'm just sort of, in my mind, the older I get, the more I sort of feel sorry for them. Or when I was younger, I would have said, no, just, stop people. And it's not that simple, I think.
Sorry, I just want some addition to this story. Ladies and gentlemen, just came back from the United States, and that why this situation is so complex, and it's make a very complex and confusing situation more complex and confusing. That the challenge is that independently, whether it's the Republic of South Africa, which is actually we can say the United States of the African continent, or whether it's the United States within America, that the living standards and the salaries, comparing the U.S. salaries and El Salvador salaries, or the salaries in South Africa and the salaries in Malawi, it's just huge differences. And the illegal migrants who arrive there, whether it's U.S. or South Africa, they are started to competing at the end, in the bottom of the hiring line, competing with the less educated people in the society from the same jobs. And because illegal aliens, they don't have insurance, they don't have any background in the country, so they will accept any labor circumstances, They will not form unions against the employers. They will not go to the authorities that the working conditions are dangerous because they are illegal. So the first question is, where's your paper to work in this country? So they are extremely vulnerable. It's very easy to provide them much lesser salaries than for the same local population with the same skills and the same education. So what the local people say, that I'm sitting at home, no job opportunities, while these people are coming and taking my job for, 50% less salary than I would do. And unfortunately, it's fueling the tension between the host community and the people arrive. And this is why there are, for example, so many, let's say, xenophobic attacks in South Africa. But we can see very similar patterns in the United States.
My next question goes to Victor. I'm really curious about this question, that how do you see the role of the gatekeeper countries, the Northern African countries? What kind of new trends do you see, and new political issues as well?
Yeah, it was my research topic in the United States, comparing the US and the European gatekeepers. Yeah, I think it's a key issue to mitigate the effects of irregular migration. It's obvious both in the case of the United States and Europe, if irregular migrants manage to get in within the US or the European borders, actually they will stay with us forever. So independently whether they have right to stay here or not, because forced repatriation, deportation doesn't work. Neither in the United States nor in Europe. So actually the collaboration with gatekeepers is a key. It's interesting that Europe has a more, and the EU member states have a more extended relationship with these countries, let's say Morocco, Egypt, Tunisia, or Turkey, or even Niger, we can say. While in the concept of the United States, it's a very new issue, because of different historical, cultural reasons. But I think in whether short, mid, or long-term perspectives, we don't have other solution that to enhance collaboration with these so-called gatekeeper countries, which is good not only for Europe, but according to my understanding, also for the gatekeepers and the countries of origin. Just one example, ladies and gentlemen, if somebody moves for an African country to Europe or the United States, across Latin America, I know the nice stories and theories about circular migration, blah, blah, blah. Just I don't see any example for this. Okay, so, and actually what's going on with these people is a clear brain drain situation. So if somebody getting and never go back to their country. So, it's a key issue for Africa, ladies and gentlemen, that whether the talented young generation will, develop their skills, opportunities in Africa or in China or United States or Europe, because it would be very fruitful for us, but it will provide a very limited benefit for Africa.
Paul, how do you see the future of the Republic of South Africa regarding climate change, water security, and this kind of extremism that's happening in the Republic?
Thank you. Yes, I think those are all very interesting questions and phenomena that sort of contribute to the challenges that we have. But I always say that most of Africa's problems, well, at least the sort of the southern part, but let's say specifically South Africa, most of the problems, if not all of the problems, are solvable problems. So let me explain that. We have horrible corruption that can be solved with a new government. Currently we don't have electricity, so the economy can't grow. That can be solved by a better government, because currently you have the president and he owns a bunch of coal mines, and we have a problem with coal mines delivering electricity. So it's the government are very much part of that. So if the democratic processes are allowed to run their course, we will see a more moderate ANC, and they'll probably not be in governance forever. This will lead to a lot of logical solutions coming. I mean, in the 80s, there were plans made for more dams in South Africa, which is a very dry country. South Africa can only be compared to certain parts of Spain. It's really a dry country. Certain parts are beautiful and green, but 72% at least isn't really arable in the European sense of the word, where if you got on a train now and you drove to Debrecen, you would see things planted all the way there. If you drove from Amsterdam to Frankfurt, you would see stuff planted or animals walking all the way through. South Africa, if you drive from Johannesburg to Cape Town, for large parts you'll see nothing. You'll see telephone poles and bushes, and that's it. It's really desert. So some of those things can be solved simply by better governance if we can replace the ANC. For instance, it's never going to change that for instance, that Australia is close to China. That's something they have to deal with. They have to make plans. But South Africa's problems of energy, our problems of crime, those are things that can be solved. I maintain the position that maybe not necessarily in my lifetime, but Africa is the continent of the future. A country like Zimbabwe, if you took, and this is scientific, if you took the methods that they're using in the Netherlands to grow food, and you did that in Zimbabwe, where they have technically enough water, you could basically feed almost the whole world. And maybe I'm exaggerating slightly, but you could feed an immense amount of people. So it's simply going through the motions of development. I maintain the position that I think Africa is the inherent challenges, which you'll know a lot about, sort of the radicalism, and that's very localized in certain areas. For the most part, the people have a culture of hard work. I agree that there's not necessarily that much of a culture of book learning, but I do think that is increasing if we look at literacy figures. And all of that will play into the South African context as well. A couple of years back, South Africa was outright the largest economy in Africa and the highest functioning one. Recently, we've seen the G7 that always invited South Africa to participate. They invited the African Union. We see things like Rwanda being a destination for international conversations all of a sudden. And we see these hubs of economic growth. Now, it's not going to happen overnight, and obviously, like if you think of what happened in Europe in the beginning of the 20th century, it was on the way to vast development, and then there came a war and things changed all of a sudden. This can obviously happen, but I do think that in the next 50 years we will see immense improvement in Africa. It can obviously be stopped by a lot of things, but if that pattern can grow, then I think that will have benefits for all. As South Africans, we are perfectly situated to help the rest of Africa, but also to sort of, and this shouldn't be taken in the wrong way, but we can also benefit from it. This means we can go and do business. You'll see everywhere you'll see sort of German shops all over the Netherlands and all over Poland. Why? Because that's where they're situated. So if we can exploit that position to sort of give products while there's an increase in living standards and economic ability, then I think for South Africa economically there can be good growth.
My next question goes to both of you. How do you see the COVID pandemic and the Ukrainian war has affected the migratory trends?
All worsened the situation definitely. Because of that, as Paul, as the presentation of Paul demonstrated, for example, the number of people in acute food insecurity increased tremendously. So, but it affected mostly migration within the countries. Even if we have the numbers, the most people migrated, we can speak about forced migration within their countries. For example, the number of Somalia is more than 1.5 million additional IDPs because of the drought, and previously the COVID-19 pandemic, which actually totally use the reserves which was in the country, which was not so much. And of course we can observe some international migration, for example, back to the Somali example, people from Somalia moving now to Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya, but this number is now not more than 100,000, which is also a lot of people. And what we could observe mainly in the last year that people from the North African countries, Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, and the middle class started to leave these countries because there was no starvation there, definitely. But the living standards, the inflation was skyrocketing, and the middle class, a part of the middle class decided to leave the region and the country. And for example, the Central Mediterranean route was full of with Tunisian, Morocco, Egyptian irregular migrants.
Thank you. So first, in terms of migration, we saw an interesting thing in just within South Africa. I'll speak to a broader sub-Saharan Africa in a moment, but we saw that because people couldn't immigrate internationally for about 2 years, we saw a lot of national migration. So for instance, in South Africa, people all of a sudden found out they can work remotely permanently, and so we have a very long coastline. People moved to small coastal cities where property is cheaper and where they'd recently gotten good internet, and so we saw some of that, but that would be what you'd probably in Europe call middle class, but in Africa would most definitely be upper middle class, to have the ability to pack up your things and move at the drop of a hat. But we did see some of that. For the most part, I think COVID had a very stalling effect on the economy, and a lot of investments that would have come in didn't come in, and the countries that would have invested all of a sudden reconsidered. So that's one thing. And then in terms of the war, if you obviously watched the news the last couple of days, you'll see that this has been very, very divisive within Africa. It's a very difficult topic at the moment. South Africa currently hold the position, which I think is very close to the Hungarian official position, that negotiations are the only way and so on. But they've come up, that wasn't initially the position. South Africa was sort of quiet on it, and various other countries as well, because you're sitting in a situation where they have vested interests on both sides. So they are financially influenced, or they have influences from China and the Chinese government leaning a certain way, or so I think in terms of that, all of a sudden it's brought things forward that we didn't necessarily hear about previously. I mean, America were part of they actually sort of, Clinton led a lot of the delegations that led to a democratic South Africa. And now you have South African ministers saying things like, no, we are opposing American bullyism. And the AGOA agreement, which has always been seen as a wonderful thing for Africa, is all of a sudden being seen as a tool that, or not being seen, but some politicians say, no, it's a tool to manipulate Africa to take the American political position or whatever. So I think the war has brought out certain lines in ideology that will be interesting in the future, especially because in some countries that received support from the Soviet Union, there is still an inherent sort of a loyalty. South Africa is the first and foremost, but you'll see that in certain other countries as well, that they sort of feel, don't want to say indebted, but they don't necessarily want to oppose Russia openly. And so I think those are are things that might be worth checking out in the next year or two. Because obviously you can't just turn your back on the West because you're very dependent on them. You speak their languages, you send your elite to their educational institutions, so you can't just turn your back on them. But then at the same time, the investment seems to no longer be primarily coming from the West. This we've known for 20 years. But so all of a sudden, I think that strong draw towards the West might not be as strong as it used to be. I'm obviously, you can hear I'm very cautious because you can very easily say something that takes a conversation into a very different line. But I think these things will play themselves out in the next couple of years. And I have to say that at least among the South African government at the moment, the antagonism towards the West is more than I have seen in a long time within the broader debate.
Okay, so I would like to turn now to the audience, whether you have questions. Just please raise your hands and we will give you a microphone, or just tell us in this way. Robbie, do you need a mic? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. My question would be regarding the UNHCR's recent report, The Global Trends, which mentioned that next to the migration crisis in Ukraine, the migration crisis in the Sudan is one of the worst that we currently can experience. What any of you think would mean to the continent of Europe or even of Africa?
Okay, yes. What is happening in Sudan, ladies and gentlemen, is a prolonged crisis, and to tell you the truth, I don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. It's a typical example when there's no possibility for a solution through negotiation. Both parties are convinced, similarly like in Ukraine, that they can win by fight and military force. And it's very obvious by the Jeddah negotiation encouraged by United States and Saudi Arabia that there will be no agreement between the two parties. The biggest, what are the problems with the Sudan, the crisis in Sudan? That before the civil war broke out in the middle of April, 1 million international refugees has already been in Sudan, mainly from South Sudan, but also Ethiopia, Chad, etc. And 2.7 million IDP had already been in the country. So altogether 5 million forcibly displaced persons. And the UNHCR estimated that perhaps 800,000 people could leave the country because of the fights. Now already 500,000 people have already left, mainly to South Sudan. You can imagine that somebody is escaping from Sudan to South Sudan and to Egypt. And because of all the reasons what we mentioned together with Paul, actually there's no free capacities in the region and in the system to tackle with this humanitarian crisis. Besides these 500,000 people, more than 500,000 who already left Sudan, there is 1.6 million additional IDPs. So more than 2 million people were forcibly displaced within these 2 months. And there's no end in sight of the story. So what we experiencing that, for example, Egypt started to close the border. And if the international community will not provide significance, and it's very important, significance assistance, which means billions of dollars and huge human resources to handle the situation, it will contribute not only a humanitarian crisis in the region, but also a political crisis. Because neither Chad, nor South Sudan, nor Ethiopia are ready to tackle with the flow of hundreds, if not millions of people. There's no reserves in the system. There are political instability still in Ethiopia, still in South Sudan, still in Chad, still in the Central African Republic. So if the world will not provide significant assistance to tackle with the situation, it will destabilize whole East Africa, which could cause a new flow of international irregular migration towards Europe and the Gulf.
Yeah, I don't necessarily have anything to contribute. That's a wonderful answer. It's very complete, and it's something definitely that's horrible and that we should check out.
We have time for only one question from the audience, if someone has any. Okay.
Hi there. I just wanted to ask, you mentioned earlier about throwing money at the problem, possibly, to I guess, reduce the need to migrate to Europe. When will that stop? Like, do you throw money forever? When do you think that maybe you should let Africa take care of Africa?
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, there's a big debate whether is there any effect of the whole development assistance, what we have provided to Africa and other regions in the last 6 decades or more. It's a very controversial issue because the whole, let's say, development assistance regime is, to say at least, is not fair. Because I had many conversations last years, since I'm dealing with Africa, that how we can help people to have their dreams, or in their dreams, be not in the United States, but in Kenya or in Somalia, etc., etc. And there are excellent programs, initiatives, answers, but actually I think the simplest answer is if somebody has an opportunity to have a relatively good job at home, which can provide enough food, clothes for him or herself and his family, and has a possibility that his kids will have a little bit better life what he or she had, in most cases it's enough for people to stay at home. And actually, back to this whole development assistance story, ladies and gentlemen, we are financing everything in the continent for annually tens of billions of dollars, but for example, not the productive sectors. Okay, we are very cautious for not to invest, for example, oil refinery capacity in Nigeria, because it's much simpler to buy the cheap oil, and refine it in Europe or in the Middle East, and send back the fuel and the gas and selling it for a much higher numbers. Or it's absolutely ridiculous. I visited Cameroon, it was a couple of years ago, and Cameroon is one of the biggest cocoa producing country, and I wanted to buy some Cameroonian chocolate for my kids, and there was no Cameroonian chocolates, but just other type of chocolates. I don't want to make a advertisement for any chocolate company for Europe, but it's a European chocolate. So it's not an innocent procedure. We should concentrate on making jobs in the continent, because it's a very simple issue, ladies and gentlemen. If you have a perspective that if you study in the school and in the high school, and after it you will get a relatively well-paid job, the family will invest the money to do this in most cases. But in many cases we are investing in education, high schools, and even universities. Young students coming out, there's no job opportunities, and it caused a lot of frustration in the society, because the promise was, if I learn hard, I will get a job. My family invested the money. It was one of the reasons behind, for example, the whole Ethiopian Tigray civil war, which broke out 2020, which was stoked by the young Kereros, the Oromo youth, the Tigrinya youth, Amhara youth, because they get secondary school, some of them the universities, but there's not enough job in the country. And the family invested, they wanted back the money. But if no job, there's no money. And it's like political instability.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I want to tell you 2 very brief stories. The first one is about 4 years ago, a bit more, I wanted to ask my wife, who's now my wife, to get married. And so, South Africa, it's full of diamonds, right? I thought, buy a diamond. Like a massive amount, I can't give you a figure, but it's more than 80% of the diamonds in South Africa get taken to like Switzerland or Netherlands and cut and then sent back. We do have some diamond cutting in Kimberley, but for diamond cutting you need sunshine. We have more sunshine than most places on earth. You need, and then it's this typical thing. It's the same with gold, the same with platinum. So I physically bought a diamond and a piece of gold that came from South Africa, that went to Europe, and that came back through a Swiss jeweling company. And this keeps happening. Oil is a good example, but the iPhone that they will use in the south of the DRC will contain cobalt that had to go from those mines all around the world and come back. Final thing with regards to that is if you look at the South African government, obviously it's a developmental state, very influenced by socialist ideology. They love to quote Lenin in every single speech. But one thing is, they recently said very proudly that 17.8 million people in South Africa, that's about 45% of all adults, receive some or other welfare from the government. They say this proudly because they have achieved something, but the reality is in the year 1999, there was about 3 million. So it has grown by a factor of 600%, the amount of people that can't look after them anymore, because exactly this. We're pumping money into this situation and saying, well, why should you get a job for 1,500 Rand a month, which is no money at all, it's 100 euros, right? Why should you do that when the government will give you 1,200 to sit under a tree and smoke? You're not going to, and it could sound cruel, and my wife hates it when I make these kind of arguments. She says, no, but we have to care. I agree we have to care, but I think caring has to go along with education and development. And the problem is, this is oftentimes linked to votes. So you get your grant, but then you have to hold a card that you're a member of the party. You have to attend the conference. So all these things sort of flow together, and I cannot necessarily say that the billions of money, the billions of dollars that's flooded into particularly the African countries that I visited has necessarily had the effect that it could have had. Yeah, maybe I should stop there.
Okay, so thank you very much. If the audience doesn't have any more questions, I would like to close today's roundtable discussion. So I can say that we are really happy that you could just join us today and come to this event. I would like to say thank you, Paul, for just coming as well. I think Paul will be available after the event if you are just want to make some questions for him. But yeah, we are also both open to add more questions. So thank you very much for coming, and we hope that you will participate more events of the Migration Research Institute, and we will see each other in the future as well. Thank you.